Hey everybody, welcome back. We are in Boca Raton, Florida at Podcast Junkies Studio, the greatest podcast studio in the country. I'm here live in Boca. Well, you're listening to it recorded, but I am here in person, not AI. And Mark is also not AI. He's in person in California. So let's welcome Mark. How are you today?
Good morning. It's now, what
It's
time is it? It's
early.
8:02.
Yeah, it's early for
8:02.
you.
Yeah.
It's early for a lot of people, but the truth is we have court typically at 8 a.m. anyway. If we're not, if we have a court hearing, often they're at 8 a.m. They're early. I've had cases, Mark, the judge sets it at 7:59, and my client says, why 7:59? And I usually tell them it's because I requested it, so we'll be the first case called. So whenever there's a reason to get a case called first, so you're not sitting around waiting, the judge will often accommodate a request to 7:59. But our whole careers, we're used to, being out of the house by 7 a.m., So,
Oh, easily. Yeah. And living on the West Coast makes it even more difficult because sometimes I have calls, if it's 9 o'clock in Florida, it's 6 o'clock here.
right. No, you and I have had hearings like that. It's 8 a.m. in Florida,
Right.
and, you just went to
Five
sleep.
o'clock.
Yeah, you just went to sleep a couple hours earlier, but you always look bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I don't know how you do it. You do cases all over the country. You hop on a red eye. You show up in New York. It's 6 a.m. You're in court by 8 a.m. Always looking fresh. You are definitely a trial machine. I'm always impressed with how you pull it together, no matter what
Well,
time zone
yeah.
you're in.
I call it the sleep bank. When you rob sleep from the sleep bank, you got to pay it back.
True, at
And
some
sooner
point.
or later, it catches up to you.
Yeah, you take a Sunday, you catch up on it. I often say to people, 'cause I never really say I'm tired, and I say it's really a mind over matter issue. I can't afford to be tired. You got to always, like I agree with you, the sleep bank. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. Like once a month, I will, on a Sunday, I'll sleep in to. Normally, I'm up by 6 every morning, but yeah, you're right. You do need that time every once in a while where you do catch up on all that sleep. So sometimes I try to do it on airplanes, but nowadays with access to, Wi-Fi, Starlink on these planes, you're working as much on a plane and compared to the old days when you could really take a nap for a couple hours.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, that's why I'm going to make a plug for JetBlue.
yeah,
I take JetBlue and I fly in the Mint section when I go to the East Coast, either Florida or New York. Um, and
yeah.
you can sleep on it because it opens up into a bed. So I take the red eye so I don't lose what's effectively 8 hours of the day between the time you get on a plane. In fact, by the time you get to the airport and the time you land and then you get anywhere, it's more than 8 hours.
Right.
So the whole day's shot. So I try to get 4 hours sleep on the plane, 3.5, 4 hours, 4.5 hours. The problem with that is it sometimes is interrupted by the fact that people bring their screaming kids
Yes.
onto the first class area, the Mint area,
Right.
which, by the way, is very expensive, but it's worth it if you're doing business.
Mm.
Um,
You know,
so they keep me up.
Talking about screaming kids on an airplane reminds me of a childhood friend of mine. Her name is Cindy Shupak. I think you've met her before. She was a senior writer at Sex and the City and showrunner. She was on Everyone Loves Raymond, Modern Family. She's done it all. A very successful comedic writer. And she's written some books and essays and this and that. And in one of these essays she wrote, she did a little vignette about birth control and children, high school age, getting pregnant and, the risks of that and education and so forth. She said the best birth control in the world for a young girl who's, going through high school and you don't want her to get pregnant is put her on an airplane next to a crying baby. So you put a child on an
Mhm.
airplane next to a crying baby, they will definitely be very, very careful to make sure they don't get pregnant in their life.
Yeah.
Obviously, she said it a lot more humorously and eloquently than I just conveyed her story. But I think it was called the Between Boyfriends book. So if anyone
Yeah.
read one of her essays for Cindy Shupak, a little plug for her. All right. So in our last episode, Mark, we talked about a lawyer who committed PPP fraud, and then we ended the episode saying we're going to do a whole episode on Lawyers Gone Wild, kind of a play off of that very famous and successful, chain of called Girls Gone Wild. That was a brand and really built up So we're calling it Lawyers Gone Wild, or some people say attorneys, but either way, Lawyers Gone Wild, Attorneys Gone Wild. But before we get into that, I just want to say, since you're not here, you can't see that I'm holding up. We have a new prop on our table here in the studio, and I gotta give a little plug for a minute. You didn't plug JetBlue, but I'm plugging. It says Camp Tawanda, so I got a little coffee mug. And what's Camp Tawanda? Why am I plugging it? So I got to share a little personal thing here. One of my daughters and her husband, they were always their whole life interested in owning a sleepaway camp. And they've worked in sleepaway camps their whole life, worked their ways up to being assistant camp directors. And a year ago, March, they had the opportunity to actually buy a camp, and it's called Camp Tawanda. It's 104 years old, the camp. It's a sleepaway camp in Pennsylvania, a town called Honesdale, Pennsylvania. And really, the plug is not so much for the camp. It's just to say how proud I am of Alana and David for what they're doing, because I had the opportunity to go up there on the opening day of camp this year. And, I saw camp. As a child, I went as a camper. And as a parent, the kids went to camps. I saw it as a parent of a camper. In fact, my mom's parents, my grandparents, owned a camp when I was a child. So it's kind of in my blood, but I never saw camps as from the business side of it, from what it is, the day-to-day grind of running a camp. And I just got to do a shout out to Lon and David about how proud I am of them, because on just the first day when I was there, like, they had to serve 1,500 meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. They had to get a bus dropping off the kids, got stuck in the mud. They had to get a tractor to pull it out. One of the kids is homesick. One of the kids has a fever. One kid's throwing up. They've got one counselor who showed up and within the first 5 hours says, "I'm leaving." And so they're, scrambling for that. One of the cabins had, and this is a big camp, like 400 campers, I think even up to 500, I'm not sure. It's a big camp. One of the cabins, the hot water wasn't working. They've got dozens of parents calling to make sure their kids arrived at camp on time. They've got a third-party vendor who's putting on a trivia show that night for the evening activity, who needs some certain microphones and this. Like, it was insane. And I'm telling you, I was so proud of Alana and David, because they remained calm and they were just efficient and effective. And all they were focused on was solving each issue as they arose and making sure their highest priority, that every child there was having the best time, having the best experience, and that their staff was also, doing really well. So I'm going to start, having my coffee mug of Camp Tawanda on set with me. I'll be drinking my coffee out of it. But I just got to give a shout out to Alana and David, who are at Camp Tawanda, because I'm really, really proud of them. It's nice when you see young people, whether they're your kids or just young people in general in this day and age, thriving and really doing great things. So they deserve a shout out, as do many of our other young adults in this country who are making a difference, which they are. Every child there is having the time of their life, and that impacts their parents, who are happy, and all their friends and so forth. So happy for them, and I was happy that I got to see it and experience it on the opening day of Camp Tawanda this summer, 2026. All right, so back to what we promised, Mark. Lawyers are no different than any other population. Lawyers get in trouble just like, doctors or a school teacher or a housewife or, a mechanic or, a nurse. Everyone, can get in trouble, a doctor. So today we're going to talk about lawyers. And I guess one of the questions I have for you, Mark, before we talk about cases is, do you think that lawyers are held to a higher standard when they do something wrong? Because obviously we take an oath, an ethical oath with the bar, whether it's California bar, Florida bar, New York bar, American Bar Association, the courts, the federal courts. We take an oath, to follow the law and so forth. And the community, the public, the judges, they all rely on us to be honorable and truthful and to be able to trust what we're doing and so forth. So what is your thought on that, and just from your experiences?
Well, my experience is that judges and juries do hold lawyers to a higher standard, and I think deservedly so. Um, and I've represented a lot of lawyers in my career who have gone wild or gone bad, and typically when they come up in front of a judge for sentencing, the judge whacks them. And because the judge is not only, I think, insulted by the fact that it's another member of his or her profession who's strayed, it's also because lawyers should know better. I mean, they're presumed to know the law, and they're supposed to be held to a higher standard. You know, like you say, they're entrusted with a lot of things, and they're supposed to, we have ethical rules. We're rule driven in this profession. So, and juries, certainly. I mean, they're not going to have any sympathy for a lawyer, especially a lawyer who's making a lot of money and has the privileges that a lot of lawyers have. So, yes, the answer is absolutely. And that's the danger that a lawyer faces where he or she uh, steps off the train
Right.
of the rightful living and
Mhm.
goes into the netherworld of doing something stupid.
Yeah.
And usually these transgressions are more based on stupidity or poor judgment than real malice.
Right.
I've never represented a lawyer who's robbed the bank
Right.
or shot and killed somebody intentionally or smuggled fentanyl across the border,
Right.
but
But
nevertheless they do stupid things.
yeah, and there are lawyers, by the way, who have done those
Right.
crimes. You just haven't represented them, neither have I. But um, yeah, and the other side to it, Mark, because I do agree. I think the judges and sentencing do and prosecutors do hold us to a higher standard. But the other side to it too is we are human. Lawyers are no different than anybody else. Where they do have some lawyers will have addiction struggles, dependency issues. Some lawyers will have mental health issues, and those types of things and circumstances that arise in their life that put pressure on them that cause them
Right.
to make poor decisions.
And
And as defense
and to your
lawyers, we present that when we defend our lawyers.
right, and to your point, because they're human, they're also driven by human circumstances and motivations that do come into play. The one of the cases, I don't know, I'll lead right into it. I want to talk about is a young woman lawyer that I represented not too long ago, who, uh, according to her, started falling in love with her client. And as a result, she did something stupid. She smuggled marijuana into the jail where the client was.
Mm.
Now, it's interesting because the first thing she said to me when I went to visit her in the lockup was, I don't know what, I still can't believe she actually said this. Said, I don't know what the big deal is. It's legal in this state.
Oh boy. Oh. Ugh.
And I did say, yeah, you're right,
Yeah.
but it's not legal to bring it into a jail facility.
Mm-hmm.
There are signs posted, um, and you should know better. So, it was a stupid move, but she was trying to accommodate him.
Right. Right.
And yeah,
Yeah.
she, had feelings for him. And as a result of that, it broke down her judgment. It's not a defense, not a legal defense. It was an argument in mitigation in front of the judge. And she got slapped hard,
Mm-hmm.
but not too hard. And the biggest problem was her license. When you're dealing with lawyers who go wild, at a minimum, what you're dealing with is the likelihood that they're going to lose their ability to practice law.
Right.
The fact I'm
Yeah, that's their livelihood, and that can be the worst pun, more painful of a punishment than putting them in jail for a year or 6 months or 8 months. Like losing your livelihood is a very big deal. It's your reputation. It becomes very hard to then, get a new job and so forth. You have to reinvent yourself. So that is
Yeah, especially you've been doing it for a long time
right.
and you have no other skills or the beauty of the legal profession, I always tell this to people, is that you can practice way beyond the time that most people are otherwise timed out of working or being hired. Once you hit into your 50s and 60s, in a lot of industries and a lot of types of businesses, you're no longer considered, desirable.
True.
But you can practice into your 70s or 80s, even as a lawyer. So, as a result, you plan on having a whole career that you don't develop any other skills.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Well,
You lose that license, you're done.
yeah, you and I know a lawyer who lost their license, and he wound up kind of reinventing himself. He became like the litigation director of a big law firm, and and he's bounced around a lot, and he's created different opportunities for himself. You know who I'm talking about, and he's done well, but I don't think he's done nearly as well as he was when he was an attorney.
Not his preference.
Right, and it's not what his passion and his love, because he was a hell of a lawyer, really, really good lawyer, bright guy. So, Mark, when you start talking about that, it dawned on me that, just like there was a whole franchise of Girls Gone Wild, we could do a whole franchise of Lawyers Gone Wild, because I started thinking as I was listening to you that, the American Bar Association and the state bar associations, they put out monthly like newspapers or newsletters. And every month there's a list of lawyers that that have been disbarred or disciplined. And I tend to look at it because, not out of being nosy, just I know we know a lot of lawyers, and I want to see what's going on. Who if anyone I know got in trouble. In fact, if they did, maybe it's the criminal defense lawyer in me. I reach out to them and tell them, hey, I'm sorry for what you're going through. Wish you the best. I don't judge, as you don't. We don't judge people, because that's why one of the reasons we're great at our job. But lawyers. The more I think about this topic, the more I realize there are lots of lawyers that do get themselves in trouble, because every episode of that magazine or every month, you're going to see, 6 or 10 or 20 lawyers listed that are either got disciplined or lost their bar license, not always for a crime, but for doing something wrong. And I remembered, as you talked about, I've seen, probably once a year, I read an article about a lawyer who went into jail, like you were saying, to visit a client and got arrested for having sex with their client in the jail. I'd say at least once a year I see that. And it's really sad, and there's a lot of, probably psychology behind why something like that would happen. But believe listeners, but we're not making this up. It really does happen. And what Mark referred to before about lawyer bringing something in, lawyers have been busted for bringing in what the jails call contraband. The jails have strict rules. When I go in, Mark, I'm so paranoid because I don't want to lose privileges. If you and I lose the privilege to go into a jail, that's going to hurt our ability to represent people. So I go to the guards and say, look, I have this discovery. I want to leave it with my client. Are you giving me permission to leave it with my client? I dot my I's, I cross my T's when I'm in the jail. But I've seen cases where lawyers have brought cell phones in, and hid them and handed them, to the jail, to their client, which is contraband. I've seen lawyers who have mailed letters that say attorney-client privilege so that the jail can't read it, and it turns out somehow an inmate turns on that client, that defendant, and tells the guard that, hey, that lawyer sent him pornography, and those lawyers have gotten in trouble. So it happens. It really does happen. Oh, and everyone should know, if you've ever gotten a call from an inmate in a jail, the recording before you answer is going to say these calls are recorded. That's just not make believe. They do record those calls, and they are listened to. Now, I'm not going to say 100% of those jail calls are listened to, but a big percentage of them are. And if the jail or staff or the prosecutor have any reason to listen, they're going to listen to 100% of them. So there have been cases I've been involved in or that I've read about, where attorneys have been on the phone with their client, a jail call or a prison call. It's supposed to be attorney-client confidential and privileged, where it usually happens where the inmate turns on their lawyer and goes and says, look, my lawyer's part of this whole conspiracy with me. I can give you a bad lawyer. And then they listen to the phone calls, because the client gives them permission, because they can waive the attorney-client privilege. And the lawyer's on the phone on a recorded line saying, yeah, we'll make sure that witness doesn't show up for trial, or things like that. Oh, yeah, we'll get you you want us to get you this in the jail. We'll get it for you. So lawyers make.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy what goes on. In fact, I had a situation where a partner of mine and I went to visit a client who was a mob boss at a federal penitentiary. And we had a conversation. Everything was perfectly normal. We come back to our office, and about a month later, we get what we call an intercept, a Title III intercept notice, saying that our conversation with our client was eavesdropped upon. That they actually had devices in the particular visiting area we were in. Actually, it was just a cubicle, um, and it overheard our entire conversation. And it was done via a warrant signed by a federal judge,
Mhm.
so permitting it. It turns out the reason was they didn't know that we were the new attorneys.
Uh,
They were actually investigating the prior attorneys.
right, right. Yeah,
The prior They didn't know. So we were, when we went in, um, they weren't expecting us. They were expecting the two prior attorneys,
right.
and the two prior attorneys, as it turns out, were using those meetings, or that is their client was using those meetings to transmit instructions, still running family business,
Amazing.
i.e.,
Yeah,
organized crime.
right.
And these lawyers were going back and providing instructions to the underboss, to the capos, to whomever. And some of them were, some pretty nasty things that they were doing. So the lawyers were under investigation for that. So we sat around, my partner and I, and we said, well, did we say anything bad about the prosecutor
Yeah,
or
exactly.
about the judge? We
Right.
weren't worried about anything illegal.
Well,
We were about saying some things that, might
yeah,
come back and people might look at us in a different way.
sure.
And we decided, no, probably not. But
Right.
the point is, these are lawyers who are doing, you see these in the movies.
You're right.
So we saw it firsthand, actually pass. How does somebody run a crime operation
Right.
from jail?
Well,
Well,
yeah, it's funny.
there it is.
Yeah, what you're saying about the lawyers or talking to them about this. A lot of times in my social activities, just in jest and in joking and just lighthearted conversation, people will say a comment to me like, as a criminal defense lawyer or former prosecutor, they'll say like, "Geez, if I'm ever going to kill my husband, I'm going to come to you because you'll know how to plan the perfect murder." Because you've seen it all, you know how to beat these cases, and every once in a while, someone will jokingly say something like that, like, "Boy, you would certainly know how to plan the perfect way to you could figure out how to get away with a crime with everything you know about the legal system and the statutes and this and that." So, you can understand if a lawyer crosses the line, which is so wrong, and they need to be held accountable if they do that. You can understand why a client might, benefit from that lawyer who's crossing the line, because we do know, we can look at it from all different angles and give them good advice on, which is against the law for us to give them advice on how to pursue a crime or initiate a crime or, carry out a crime. But kind of smart of those defendants in the prison to rely on their lawyers for advice on how to pull off the perfect crime or keep their criminal business enterprise ongoing. So,
Well, the attorney-client privilege, and I think we may have discussed this in an early episode, but as strong as the attorney-client privilege is, it doesn't extend to, future crimes or ongoing criminal activity.
right,
And in that regard, if the lawyer is either intentionally or unintentionally involved in doing something on the client's behest that the client is intending to commit a crime, then they can pierce that privilege. They can actually force you, the lawyer,
right,
to disclose what was said. And that's what we call the crime fraud exception to the attorney client privilege. And it is often used as a tool by prosecutors when they think that stuff has gone on between the defendant and the lawyer, that's of a ongoing criminal nature.
yeah,
So we have to be very careful what our clients talk to us about and what we respond to them with.
mm,
And a lot of times clients have said to me, well, I'd really like to do this and like to do that. And if you tell them, well, it's against the law and, it's wrong and it's immoral or whatever, sometimes they just don't listen to you because, they think you're just a Boy Scout.
right,
So I not only mention that, but more importantly, I point out to them the folly of what they're suggesting, that they're going to be caught, that it's going to backfire on them, it's going to make their case worse. Give them the practical side to that. And as a result, more often than not, they listen to you.
Yeah, on a civil matter, I was just talking to a civil litigation attorney who told me that they were giving this client advice on what not to do and what they should do, and the client didn't follow the advice, and now they're in trouble. It's a civil matter. It was about purchasing a company that was already in bankruptcy, and basically the civil lawyer said if you put in an offer now, you're going to get pulled into the bankruptcy. So wait for the bankruptcy to go through, and then you can put in your offer. And then the client, of course, they ignored the advice, again, civil, not criminal, put an offer, they get pulled into bankruptcy, and the client basically said, well, you're a lawyer sitting behind a desk, very conservative, kind of, in your ivory tower or whatever, you're not an entrepreneur like me, and that's why you're not going to ever make real money, and I'm going to make big money. But, they sometimes just think they hear the lawyer gave them the right advice, and they chose not to follow it. So, and that happens in criminal as well, like you just said. But, Mark, I was wondering about these. When you found out about this, the subpoena, and that there was a federal subpoena that allowed them to put these listening devices in, what was the context of the prosecutor disclosing that to you? Were they saying, "Hey,
Well,
we made a
it's
mistake and we need to disclose it to you"?
no, when you are the subject of a Title III interception, they do send you a notice after a certain period of time. And so that we got something in the mail back then. There were a lot of more mail used than it is now. This was about 20 years ago or so, maybe longer. And we got that notice, and the first thing we said, "What the hell?" So we called the prosecutor on the case, and we said, "Why?" I remember very distinctly speaking to this assistant U.S. attorney and saying, "Why the hell?" I was angry
Yeah,
as I didn't know what the background
right.
that I later learned was. So why the hell are you listening to our conversation? And he said, "Oh," she said, "Yeah, I did listen to it. We actually minimized it, meaning we shut it off at a certain point because we realized that you guys had gone in and not the other
Right.
attorneys." I said, "Well, then, when you heard my voice and you heard the voice of my partner, who's a woman, why didn't you shut it off right there and then?
Exactly.
Because your obligation is to minimize it." And he said, "Well, we just wanted to make sure you guys weren't part of the whole thing."
Right.
I said, "Well, I got to tell you, I'm really insulted by it, but that was it.
Yeah.
That particular prosecutor was a bit of, I get along with, I'm sure you do too, 99.9% of the U.S. attorneys around the country that I've dealt with. Some have become friends. Some we will beat each other up in the courtroom and then have a drink
Right.
afterwards. But this guy was, well, let's
Well,
call it plainly, he was an asshole.
yeah. Well, it was making me. The reason I asked that question is because you and I have been involved in cases where we have, especially the white collar business crimes, where there's thousands or hundreds of thousands and sometimes even millions of pages of documents and emails and files, and the government gets a hold of them, and they are not allowed to look at attorney-client privilege because sometimes a client will call us a year before they ever get indicted for something, and we're communicating with them throughout that process, and the government, they have software that scans these voluminous files of discovery or evidence, and one of the things it's scanning for, among many things, looking for incriminating evidence, but it also does scan for whether there's any attorney-client privilege information in these thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of pages of documents. And the goal of that software is to eliminate the government's exposure to any attorney-client confidential information, communications. And so sometimes you and I have gotten calls from the government saying, look, we ran it through our system, but we need to disclose to you this one email or this one document came through that we happen to see, and we're fully disclosing it to you. It was totally an accident. It was inadvertent. Our software just didn't pick up on it. We did, the best we could to avoid it, but this one thing. And I was just wondering if that was kind of the context in this case where they said, look, we had the right to put this listening device in there under Title III interception, but we didn't realize that you were the new lawyers taking over, so we wouldn't have listened. But I do get their point that they said to you, they're like, look, we needed to make sure that you weren't also part of the conspiracy with the former legal team, the legal defense team. So, if I were a prosecutor on that particular case, which you and I were both prosecutors, I get that, and I would say, yeah, I'd probably listen for the first 10 minutes or so, and then when it was clear that the new legal defense team was not in cahoots with the old legal defense team that was under suspicion and under investigation, I would have turned the listening device off. It's a little sticky issue, though. But I
Yeah, well, a lot of times when people listen in the old days, I call it the old days, but back when I was a prosecutor in the 1970s, um, we didn't have emails or text messages as means to, that were evidence.
right,
Most of our evidence, especially in these organized crime cases or narcotics cases, came in the form of wiretaps.
yeah,
So we would have, officers, agents listen to these things and try to comb through them and see if there's any evidence of criminal conduct. And I remember one time, the first time I actually sat down and listened to a tape, and it was on a reel to reel, the old reel to
wow,
reels,
uh huh,
um, and listened to it. And as I'm listening to it, I'm looking at the cop and he's laughing at me while I got my headphones on because he knows what I'm listening to. And it's 20 minutes of Anthony, when are you going to come home? I'm making some spaghetti. And it's what you like. And I got this and I got some nice wine. Anthony, when are you coming home? 20 minutes of that.
wow,
And
yeah,
I take the thing off finally. I said, "Can you explain to me why we have a wiretap on this guy?"
right, yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, that there could just be that one word or one sentence that changes everything. So you just never know unless you listen every second of it, I guess.
but now they rarely,
I
as
know.
the example I gave you that happened to us, in the visiting room, that's pretty much dated because I would tend to say 95%, and I'm probably low on that, of all the non-testimonial evidence that comes in the trials that I handle defending clients in federal court, 95 plus percent of the evidence is in the form of emails
Right.
and text messages.
Right.
And a lot of times people use, Signal or WhatsApp or
Yeah.
some of the other
More encrypted.
supposedly
Encrypted.
more protected.
Yep.
And in fact, using that winds up backfiring on the client because the first thing the government argues to the jury or even brings out during the examination of witnesses is that you're using a site designed to protect
Right.
the secret or the confidentiality of the communication. If you have nothing wrong going on, why do you need to protect it?
That's right.
Right?
Yep. No, you're right.
So,
Well,
and so it's amazing the amount of things that people put in writing that wind up hanging them.
yeah. They do. You got to really think through. You share that with children. Like especially with like the sexting where kids put out pictures that young
Oh my
kids.
God, yeah.
We gotta say you got to if you're gonna put something in writing, it's gonna be there forever, and you need to think two or three times before you put something and push send because do you want this out there? Could it ever come back to hurt you? And so forth. So, but you also alluded to the relationship that we have with our prosecutors and judges, and we may battle in the courtroom, but then we have a beer together. But part of this topic of lawyers gone wild, or they in other areas of legal practice, say divorce law, for example, or civil litigation, complex civil. Sometimes lawyers they go for each other's jugulars. I mean, I talk to some of my friends and they get ugly from lawyer to lawyer. And I'm not saying those result in criminal offenses or arrests or, but sometimes maybe a ethical bar complaint or something. But lawyers are human and they can get pretty darn aggressive. But we have I think it's unique compared to the rest of the law in the criminal world. We respect each other. We advocate for our client, and the prosecutor advocates for the government, and they take it seriously. We all take our roles seriously, but in general, we get along well. We respect each other and so forth. But I've seen some divorce lawyers going at it, worse than the couple that's getting divorced and can't stand each other. The lawyers almost look like the opposing counsel need to get a divorce. Again,
Well, you're
ugly.
absolutely right. And in fact, it's pretty common to say that civil lawyers get along in heated battles much less than criminal lawyers do,
Right.
defense attorneys do with the prosecutors.
Right.
And I think some of that has to do with the fact that it's been my experience that judges, especially federal judges, or even criminal judges sitting in criminal cases in state court, have a much tougher view of lawyers stepping out of line or treating each other with disrespect, or more importantly, hiding evidence or doing something that is unethical or against the law.
Right.
And so we tend to, for the most part, I mean, a lot of instances where government is engaged in misconduct and instances where defense attorneys have, but in criminal cases, much less than civil cases. I've seen civil cases where lawyers literally destroy evidence,
Yeah. Yep.
where they're literally um, state testify
Hmm.
or put things in an affidavit that are clearly perjury,
Yeah.
and yet nobody does anything about it.
Mm.
And I'm aghast at that. I mean, to me, you got to police this because, we are, like we said, held to our standard. And more importantly, if we're going to be lying to the court has to hold us accountable for that.
That's true.
But I've seen it happen again and again in civil cases. And in divorce cases, and don't get me started about this, but in divorce cases, the amount of times that people lie under oath,
Right.
and not when we're not just talking
Mhm.
attorneys, I'm talking the litigants, is astounding. And nobody does anything about it.
Yeah.
Why? Because I guess it's expected in the heat of the moment with all that passion involved, the love and hate dynamic, um,
Mhm.
it's tolerated.
You're right.
It's horrible.
Yep, you're right. It is. It's horrible. They go after each other, and they then you'll talk to them, say, "Oh, that lawyer, he's a fucking piece of crap. You can't believe a word he fucking says." Da, da.
Yeah.
And you hear that, and we don't really hear that so much in our field. But you and I, we'll talk about a case or two. But we've represented a lot of lawyers over the years. Our lawyers, recognize that we're really good at what we do, and when they get in trouble, we're their first phone call. I mean, you've referenced already one, attorney Scott Rothstein. That was a internationally renowned case that you worked on, and he was alleged, one of the things to have done was create fake documents with judges' signatures and so forth. You and I will do a whole episode. We can do a whole franchise on this Lawyers Gone Wild, but one day we'll talk about our client who is a lawyer who was involved in that big conspiracy with tow truck drivers, auto body shops, personal injury attorneys, and chiropractors. You remember that whole one? And
Sure.
yeah, so we'll talk about that one day. But yeah, so lawyers do get in trouble, and we've represented them. And there's one that I was going to share with our listeners. It was actually out in your neck of the woods in California. It was a lawyer, we'll just call him Attorney Zach. I'm going to call this the cops in my back pocket case. The listeners, you'll understand why I'm calling it that in a few minutes. So, Attorney Zach, again, I get a call from, he knew a lawyer out in California who was actually a criminal lawyer, said, "No, this case is a little more than you need someone like Guy." So he called me, and he said, did some research about him to confirm he had a very, very successful practice. And he said he was criminal attorney out there. And he said he had a client came in to interview him, and that client, or I think, Mark, you do the same thing. I call him PNC, potential new client. So a PNC came in to interview him. They were charged with drug trafficking and resisting arrest with violence, and both serious felonies. And they bonded out. They had like a $10,000 bond. They paid the bond, and they got out of the jail. And now they want to go hire a lawyer. So they call. They're talking to this lawyer, Attorney Zach, and when he gets to Attorney Zach, the PNC says, "I just interviewed another lawyer. I actually hired them. I liked them a lot, so I retained them. I paid them the retainer that they requested." And the lawyer's like, Zach's like, "Well, why are you here then? If you like that lawyer, that's great. So why are you here?" They said, "Well, I just left their office a half hour ago, and I just thought it was rude to cancel on you with only a half hour notice. You were kind enough to schedule this time with me. So just to be polite, I thought I would come." So, okay, I respect that. Thank you. And then they continued to have a normal, I don't know, PNC meeting, an interview of the client, the defendant, interviewing the lawyer, so that the meeting continued even though they had just hired somebody else. And at the end of the meeting, the PNC actually hired Attorney Zach, and then they called the client, the defendant called the attorney number one, and canceled the retainer. That attorney was polite and said, "Okay, I get it," and so the case moves forward with Attorney Zach representing this defendant, who's charged again with serious charges of drug trafficking, resisting arrest. And it turns out that the defendant made a really, really good decision hiring the second lawyer, Attorney Zach. And why do I say that? I say it because Attorney Zach filed a motion to dismiss in the case, which are very rarely granted. They are occasionally granted, but not often. And Attorney Zach was victorious on having the motion to dismiss granted by the judge. And what was cool for this Attorney Zach was the timing was great, because it actually was a little bit high profile. It got some news coverage. And about 6 weeks later, Attorney Zach was leaving for for his own destination wedding and honeymoon at an exotic resort. And so life couldn't be better, right? Gets a big victory. He's going off to get married in 6 weeks. Life is good. Well, so why is Attorney Zach calling me? Well, turns out that the attorney number one, who's the attorney that the defendant, hired and then canceled the representation, when the client actually came by to pick up their check for the retainer, because the attorney one said, "I haven't even deposited your check yet. You can come pick it up, or I can shred it." And they said, "No, I'll pick it up." So they stopped by to pick it up. And attorney number one said, "Well, no, I'm totally fine. I respect your decision. I support whatever decision a defendant wants when it comes to choosing counsel. The Constitution gives you a right to counsel, so you chose your counsel, and I respect that. But I was just curious, why did you choose them?" And the defendant said, "Well, Attorney Zach told me that they have all the cops in their back pocket." That's why this episode's called "Cops in My Back Pocket." He said they have all the cops in their back pocket, and because of that, they will get me a better result than any other attorney can possibly get me. And so attorney number one said, "Okay, I do have a receipt here that I need you to sign showing that you're canceling my representation, that I'm returning the check to you, and that you are canceling because the attorney you hired has the cops in their back pocket, and you're more comfortable going that route." Very, very, very smart, clever move on attorney one's part. And if you're a chess player, you probably are listening saying, "Ha ha, I know exactly why this lawyer did this." Well, he did it because he was very suspicious of this Attorney Zach, and said, "This is not right. It's not kosher. It's not against, for a lawyer to tell a client that they have cops in their back pocket smells fishy. It smells criminal." And so attorney one got that in writing, because you don't know if that defendant's ever going to change their position or so forth. And they decided, the attorney one decided, "I'm going to follow this case. I'm going to see what happens with this case." Maybe the attorney was bluffing. Maybe it was Attorney Zach was bluffing, and it was just a sales tactic to get hired, for a good fee in a serious case, and just said, "Oh yeah, these cops are my buddies. They'll take care of me." Or, it might have been so, but maybe there was some truth behind it. So the attorney one followed the case. And as soon as attorney one saw that the case was dismissed, they dug a little deeper into it. And they contacted the motion to dismiss was granted. They contacted the Office of the State Attorney and their investigative unit. So the Office of the State Attorney, and known as the District Attorney, the prosecutor, the government agent law firm that prosecutes cases in the state. And they started investigating. They told them what the attorney one told the government, what their concerns were about Attorney Zach, and they opened a criminal investigation. And as it turned out, So before this hearing, the motion to dismiss hearing, Attorney Zach had to subpoena the officers to show up at the hearing, and he was going to cross-examine them. So basically, what happened is he actually he would have been on direct exam because he was moving for the motion to dismiss. So he's the one that had to bring the witnesses forward. What he did was he sent subpoenas, and this was all determined through this investigation. And this was a time, it was quite a while ago, where subpoenas would go into the police department. The receptionist would take them and put them into little boxes, like a mailbox for each officer, basically. They all had their own little cubby hole. And they would go into those boxes, and the officers would check them daily or whenever they were on duty. They would look in their box and pull their mail. And they would have subpoenas from, lots of different cases. Any case they were working on, they could have gotten a subpoena in. And what this lawyer did was he had a really tight relationship with the administrative employee at the police department, and not law enforcement officer, but administrative personnel. He had them go into the boxes of the officers that he subpoenaed and pull the subpoenas from the box and shred them and throw them in the garbage. So the receptionist was able to confirm, with notarized under oath, that I received the subpoena and I delivered it to the box of the officer. Well, what would happen if that subpoena was pulled from the box and thrown in the garbage? Well, the officer would never know that there was a hearing coming up, and therefore they would not show up for the hearing. Well, that's exactly what happened. The officers that had all the incriminating evidence in the case failed to show up for the motion to dismiss. And there were a couple other officers involved in the case that had some incriminating, but nothing too serious that could really override or get a ruling against the defense on the motion to dismiss. The attorney Zach actually had very strong relationships with these officers who were not that involved. They were kind of on the periphery of the case. They were there kind of on the scene, but just acting as security to make sure no one interfered with the investigation. But they weren't, talking to victims or witnesses or talking to the suspects and so forth. So they didn't have a lot of evidence or information to really help with the case. But this attorney Zach knew these officers really well. He knew them so well that he'd actually done a lot of favors, legal favors for them, when they or their family member or friends had some criminal issues, or one of them had a big speeding problem on, driving their car. So he had done a lot of favors for these other officers. So they showed up. He didn't have their subpoenas pulled from their box. It was the exact opposite. He made sure those officers showed up. But interesting, when they showed up, their memory was very weak. They couldn't remember for certain really what happened. It was a little confusing. They'd had 100 arrests since this case occurred. They couldn't remember. They weren't certain. Some of them didn't, were actually downplayed what they remembered and so forth. So as a result, the judge really didn't have anything to go on at the hearing, and the motion to dismiss was granted. Now, what was the outcome? What did this lead to, besides the most important for the defendant was that his criminal charges were dropped, at least for the time being. So 3 cops that showed up that were good friends in the back pocket of this lawyer, they all had internal affairs investigations. We call them IA investigations. And before the conclusion of those investigations, all 3 cops resigned. I think they now work as security guards, making probably a tenth of the money they were making and having a very weak pension plan and 401k plan and so forth. So that decision helping out this lawyer destroyed their livelihood and careers. So big impact on them. And then the administrative employee who pulled the subpoenas from the mailboxes of the officers who really had the incriminating evidence, they got fired. That administrative person got fired. I don't know where they went. I know they were looking for a job for a long time. Hopefully they did find something. But these things do happen. So then what happens to the attorney Zach, right? Attorney Zach is the mastermind. He's the one that orchestrated this whole thing. They are, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, they're a lawyer. They're held to a higher standard, as we should be. I had some really, really, really intense discussions with the prosecutor, negotiations, discussions, debates, just heated, professional, but heated, back and forth with them. On one hand, they wanted to really go hard after this lawyer because they were very offended by what he had done and the impact it would have, and the if they didn't go hard on him, the message they would send to others in the legal community and so forth. And for reasons that I really can't say on this Zoom, on this podcast, because of really some just confidential security issues dealing with the prosecutor's office and their connection to this case. All I can tell you is at the end of the day, the agreement was that the lawyer would surrender his bar license. He would no longer be an attorney. And in exchange, the government would not prosecute him. And again, I wish I could tell the details, but there's some confidential things that occurred on the part of the government that we had to that encouraged them to make this deal, and that I promised would never become public knowledge or information. And I'm going to obviously honor that because our reputation and our relationships with the government and their ability to trust us is sacrosanct, and it's very, very important. So I honor that. But at the end of the day, the attorney who could no longer practice law because of this case, because he surrendered his bar license, he had to reinvent himself. We kind of alluded to that earlier, how lawyers who lose and a doctor, if they lose their license, or a school teacher, they reinvent themselves. This lawyer had done a lot of cases with drug addicts, and he knew a lot about drug rehab centers. So he actually started opening a bunch of drug rehab centers, and he did really well for a while there. I think he was making like $1 million a week. He built a couple centers. They were very, very profitable. But some people just can't help themselves, and he wound up getting caught in one of these pain pill clinics that people have heard of, where basically drug addicts and people addicted to pain pills just show up and say, "Hey, I need my pills," and the doctor, gives them some medicine, and without really going through proper protocol of medical care, they just basically are writing prescriptions. So this lawyer created out in California a bunch of pain pill clinics and hired doctors to run them, and he wound up getting himself in trouble again with that, and then he did wind up going to prison. I did not represent him on that case, and I don't know if I think he's out of prison by now, but even though he reinvented himself, had a good thing going, he still crossed the line, unfortunately. And so he was making a lot of money, but he wasn't doing it the right way. Very smart, person, and could have made, we see this a lot with like white collar crimes where people can make a very, very, very good living, but for them it's just not enough due to greed and self-interest, and they cross the line to make more money, and they wind up getting themselves in criminal trouble. So that was an interesting case, that I had with a lawyer. It's funny because I was just thinking as we talked about this topic, Mark, that early in my career, really early, like the first couple of years, for some reason I was getting a lot of referrals from women who worked in exotic, clubs, the strippers and so forth, and they would come and they would offer, actually sex in exchange for representation. And of course, I never accepted that and would always require money, and I wouldn't take cash from them. They'd have to write a check or put it on a credit card. But I do know, we just keep thinking about this, and I joked earlier about we could do a whole franchise on Lawyers Gone Wild, but we really could, because no individual is perfect. No industry has perfect professionals in it, and lawyers, are no exception. We do have lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers in this country, and they get in trouble. And I did know lawyers at that time in my community that were accepting those kind of fringe benefits, that were bartering with those clients, that instead of paying me money, for your representation, I'll take sex in exchange. There were lawyers I know who did that. And so, lawyers are human and they're fallible like all other people. And we do our best. And, but in hindsight, I always look at that situation and say, if you do something wrong, I was going to say, if you get in bed with a defendant who's committed a crime, pardon the pun, because there was a prostitute looking to get in bed in exchange for paying me a fee. If you get in bed with them, there's a good chance you're going to wind up, in jail. So, you got to always take the high road, follow the law, do the best you can for your clients, but never cross the line. and that's kind of our compass and our barometer and our ethical goalposts that we have to follow always. But there are humans. We are all human, and some people do make mistakes. And if they make the mistake, they call us, and we do everything we can to help them manage and work through the mistake that they made, and hopefully get an outcome that is as benign as possible, so that they can continue on with their life and their profession and so forth. So I don't know, Mark, if you had another specific case. I know we've been going on for almost an hour now, but if you don't, we'll talk about, staying tuned for the sponsor ad at the end of the episode, because they do make this podcast possible. We like to acknowledge our sponsors. Today is Lang Realty, and they're high-end. They do all realty. They even do rentals, but they do every part of residential real estate you can imagine, and they have some commercial realtors there as well. And of course, we remind our viewers to subscribe, which is free. To subscribe to our podcast, like it, post about us, and so forth, because we are growing, and we appreciate the fan base, and we love bringing you our crazy-ass stories. Did you have another one, Mark, or are we wrapping it up?
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up, because the ones I have quite a few, and we can continue this, subject at another time. I want to talk about the combination of lawyers acting wild and dirty judges.
Yeah.
And there are a whole host of examples of that, and a couple of matters that I've actually represented people who were involved in that
Yeah.
enterprise, if we want to call it.
Oh,
But until next
yeah.
time.
By the way, before you say that, it just reminded me of we've had such incredible careers. Every time we talk, it reminds me of a prosecutor who was absolutely horrific, crossed the line, lied, misrepresented, the worst, and then they became a judge. We're going to talk about that person as well. We won't be able to mention their name, but yeah, they cross the line too, judges. So the minority of them, not very few of them, but they do. They're human. So until next time, Mark, what do we say?
Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, you're free to go.
You're Free to Go is sponsored by Lang Realty, South Florida's premier residential real estate broker. Whether you're buying, selling, or renting a home or condo, Lang's experienced realtors are standing by ready to help you. Contact one of Lang's top realtors today at 561-703-2427. Everything expressed and discussed in this episode are the opinions and experiences of attorneys Guy Fronstin and Mark Nurik and their guests. All ethical rules are complied with. Attorney-client privilege and confidential information is not shared or released during these episodes, and names, dates, locations, and other identifying information may be changed to protect confidentiality. Topics are embellished, and none of the statements made constitute legal advice and should not be considered or relied on as such.